chair for the C3 program, Connected Car Conference. And to my right, we have Ted Cardenas. I'll let him introduce himself.
I'm Ted Cardenas. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Pioneer Electronics, the Car Electronics Group.
And I'm Dan Costa, Editor-in-Chief of PC Magazine. We also run Geek.com and ExtremeTech.com for Ziff Davis Publishing.
And we wanted to kick this off with a bit of an aftermarket perspective because for decades, a lot of the innovation has come from the aftermarket. And kind of wanted to start out by kind of looking back. I mean, 15 years ago, the buzzword was telematics. And I still think when you say telematics to the average person, they look at you like, what does that mean? And usually I'll say OnStar, and then they'll go, oh, okay, I get it. But wanted to kind of look back about, what's going on now with the connected car. I mean, we couldn't imagine 15 years ago that we would have all of these devices basically in the dash. I mean, that's how I look at it. I mean, people are used to having these portable devices, all these features in their vehicle, or in their hands rather, and they want them in the vehicle as well. And the aftermarket, I covered the aftermarket for years and years, and it was interesting where you would start to see a lot of the innovation coming from the aftermarket and then later adopted, at least in car electronics, by the automakers. And that's changed a bit. I think Ford Sync was a kind of a watershed moment, I know for me covering the space, where you started to see the OEM getting a lot more aggressive about adding this type of connectivity into the dash. I know Pioneer, since Ted and I have known each other for a long time, when we still had hair, I think, back then. And, I've been watching what Pioneer is doing. I think they were the first ones to have app radio in the car. And most recently, they introduced CarPlay. I think we're one of the first aftermarket companies to introduce CarPlay. And I was kind of really happy to see that. I kind of have my doubts about CarPlay in some ways. You can read my columns about that if you want. But, it's cool to see the aftermarket basically staying innovative. Do you want to talk about that a bit, Ted?
Well, yeah, what I would say is, as you mentioned, Doug, I think it's been quite a journey over the last 10 or 15 years. I remember answering questions at CES in the early 2000s about what is telematics. I think we were talking about a panel that Doug and I were on in the early 2000s about the biggest question being, what is 802.11? We didn't even call it Wi-Fi at that point.
What is telematics? But no, never mind.
Well, and I think that was such a great question back then. I remember we were in racing at the time. We had won the Indy 500, and the closest thing we had at that time was telemetry. It's data coming off the car. So when we'd get that question at CES, it'd be, what is telematics? It's data that can be coming from the car and going somewhere. What do we do with that data, and why would the consumer want it, was kind of the big question. But now we fast forward to today, and everybody's got a smartphone, and everybody's got a tablet, and everybody's connected. It's become a completely different world because now the consumer expects to have access to all of this content and this data. And so I think the consumer and other industries outside of really the car space have defined what telematics can be. But I don't think we're done yet, right?
No, and the one thing I would add to it is that when I thought about telematics, and I had just as much trouble defining it as a journalist as you did, it used to mean GPS. And GPS was like, oh, imagine if every car knew where it was. And we could tell where it was, and it could give you directions inside the car in real time. And that was really cool. And it was expensive, but it could be done. And that was the future of the connected car. And now you can't give away standalone GPS devices because the aftermarket's gone, because it's built into our phones. We take it for granted. Technology's moved so fast that it just totally eclipsed that feature. And now the connected car needs to mean something else. And just that rapid pace of change, we're seeing that in the smartphone space, we're seeing it in the technology space. I don't know that we always see it in the automotive space.
Yeah, and it's got to be challenging, again, after covering the aftermarket for years and years, it's got to be challenging from, a brand like Pioneer. At the same time, it seems like there's all these opportunities, especially with, the slow time to market that you see with automakers. So maybe if you can talk a bit about that, Ted, because you guys have been, I mean, CarPlay was introduced in, was Geneva show, so that was beginning of March, and you guys had a product out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think, what I'd say, and to go back to what you said, Dan, I think it's been interesting both at the OE level and the aftermarket level. You said that navigation as a feature. And we are so used to introducing, whether it's cassette or compact disc or MP3 or iPod control as really a major product. And navigation for many of my peers and Pioneer was always a product category. And it is so quickly evolved into just simply being a feature. And so now it's about adding other features such as app radio mode and mirror link and now Apple CarPlay. So yes, the announcement in March by Apple was that Apple CarPlay existed and that later this year there would be some OE manufacturers that had it. I think they announced with 5 auto manufacturers. And then in April, we were able to announce that we would be adding the feature as well. We actually don't have it yet. We are adding it to 5 existing models, which is great for us. So it's the 5 products we introduced at CES, what we call our next line of products. And they will receive a firmware update later this summer, which will enable Apple CarPlay. But Apple CarPlay is another great solution, another great example of how a consumer expects to have that connectivity in the car. But again, it's specific to iPhone users. It's specific to the iPhone 5 platform. What's just as important is taking the consumer that's bought into the connected car over the last, again, 2 years, 3 years. It was 3 years ago that Pioneer introduced the app radio here at CE Week. And making sure that that consumer has the ability to update their vehicle and their platform to have that connected car, because it is such a key, important feature or really what the consumer wants to do with that device in the vehicle.
But wait, back up. You were saying it's existing units. I probably read that in a press release.
I'm sure you did, Doug. Come on.
So if I bought a Pioneer unit, I don't know, last month, then I can add this feature later. How would you do that?
And I think that goes to the connected car story as well. Consumers are so used to having their smartphone and being able to install an app or a piece of software that will update to the latest features. So we introduced 5 models at CES. We began shipping them in March. And with this firmware update that will come in this summer, so hopefully soon, we don't have an ETA at this point, but those consumers will be able to go to the Pioneer website, download a piece of firmware, install it onto their product, and gain the ability for Apple CarPlay at that moment. And they already have what they have. As long as they have an iPhone 5S, 5C, or 5 that's running the latest iOS 7.11, they've already got Apple CarPlay in their phone. Once the Pioneer radio is updated with the firmware that will support Apple CarPlay, they simply plug in their phone and they've got Apple CarPlay. But that ability to update an existing piece of hardware that they've already made an investment in is fast becoming the expectation of the consumer. So having that platform which can support that is really critical to this connected car space.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great point, is that the connected car is defined more by the platform than the fact that there's a built-in LTE connection to the car. That's the big story, and that enables a lot of functionality, and it enables a lot of services and a lot of features. But I think this idea of the car is something that evolves over time, the same way our phones evolve, although only for 2 years. Then we trade them in, we get a new phone. But most of these cars are going to be held for, the average car's on the road for 11 years now. That's a long product life cycle, and vendors need to service those customers throughout that entire cycle. And that and they're going to need software updates, they're going to need firmware updates, they're going to need feature packs. And that's going to be part of the value customers are going to expect. I think it sounds like Pioneer's already doing that. I don't know that the auto industry is moving quite as quickly.
Now, I know with automakers have to deal with, in the aftermarket too, have to deal with a lot of distracted driving issues. And it's all great. I mean, we're going to talk about that later today. In fact, the first panel, I think it's probably one of the biggest issues facing the connected car. Aftermarket is a little different, but I know that you guys work on that. So, how do you do that as far as bringing these type of features to the car and making sure that they're safe to use behind the wheel?
Well, certainly distracted driving has become such a hot topic over the last couple of years, but really it's nothing new. You know, Dan mentioned, you know, navigation. So even in the early 2000s, when all of the aftermarket companies were introducing GPS turn-by-turn navigation devices, we were with, you know, the CEA and the Automotive Division Board, we were working with states on legislation to ensure that these products were safe to use. You know, NHTSA's guidelines for OE devices last year that they announced, phase 1, was very interesting, I think, for a lot of the aftermarket companies, Pioneer including, because we already have a set of guidelines that we build product to. And so while the letters weren't exactly the same, the spirit of their guidelines and the spirit of Pioneer's guidelines and others was enforced. You know, they were talking about it in a matter of seconds. In Pioneer, we talk about it in the matter of screen touches. But the spirit of it remained the same. What's important from that, I think the message to take away on distracted driving is companies that have got experience in integrating technology into the vehicle, such as Pioneer, we know that you can't simply take a technology that exists outside of the vehicle and put it in the car and assume that it's safe for the user to use while they drive. It's very important to design that interface, such as Pioneer's app radio interface, such as other companies' navigation interface, the OEs, you know, we were talking about Ford Sync and others. Those are all companies that we have a lot invested in making sure that the interface is designed in a way that the driver can operate the vehicle and use that technology at the same time. So it really is important as we now take the device from the outside of the vehicle, which are great devices, but we've all sat across the table from someone who's, you know, totally engrossed in their phone, and you can't even carry on a conversation. So imagine that person trying to do it while they drive. Taking that technology and putting it in the dash so that they can use it safely, keeping their eyes on the road and their hands on the wheel is, again, a very important part of this conversation.
And does voice play a role in that? Because I know I have a older car, and I have an older Pioneer system, and I still have the microphone up on the visor, and it's kind of antiquated now. But I know that, you know, that was 1996, so almost 20 years ago, that Pioneer was you know, integrating voice into the car, and you know, in some ways it's gotten to a lot better. In some ways we still have a ways to go with voice. So is that how you look at the, you know, the best way to interface with the infotainment system in the car?
Well, I think voice is one of the important points, certainly. You know, it can give you an opportunity to truly have a conversation with the product in the dash, but it has to be usable. You know, I was just reading an article on the plane yesterday. It was a review of the Xbox One and how now the Connect device of the Xbox One is relying so much on voice control. And obviously with Apple CarPlay and Siri, voice has become a very important part of the interface. But yes, Doug, going back to 1997, actually, which is when Pioneer introduced voice recognition.
My car's a 96.
Yeah, I'm surprised you still have that. The CDVC1, Doug, well done. But that device was, you know, we were so cutting edge at that point because we were taking a recording of your voice and mapping that to the compact disc that was in your CD changer.
Okay, so now you're going to really
I'm really going to, you know, call you out, Doug. But
Got a CD player in your trunk?
It was a 100-disc CD player.
It was 50. It was 50. Well done.
All right.
Clearly, you've got twice as many in your car. But
I remember we got to.
But
I had two.
You had two. You could do that. Well, wow, Doug's really passionate about this. But you know, to look at where we were in 1997 of making a recording of your voice and then mapping that to a compact disc, to now being able to ask a voice recognition engine, take me to the Newark airport, and having it work and listen and call out to the cloud, and that connection to the cloud. So it can run on all of those servers as opposed to just that single chip that resides in your car, Doug, is really significant. But again, it has to work. It has to be something that the consumer wants to use, and it is easy enough to use. There's a reason why we still have knobs and buttons and keys in our cars, is because sometimes it's a lot easier to reach over to a knob and turn it to adjust the volume than it is to press a button and say volume up. And so it all goes into this whole interface that we are developing for the vehicle to ensure that, hey, we make these functions and we make these interfaces so that they're usable, not just because we have the technology to do something else.
Yeah, I got to say, full disclosure, I don't actually own a car right now. I'm a New Yorker. I rent a lot of cars, and I test a lot of cars. But and it's actually given me this great perspective because it actually puts me in a lot of new models. I get to see a lot of interfaces, and I think I'm not alone in this, but I'm incredibly disappointed by in-car interfaces. I find it extraordinarily difficult to find something that I like, that I know how to use, and I'm not giving it a lot of time. I'm usually renting a car for a couple of days and returning it. But I've been in many situations where I get very sophisticated, slick touchscreen interfaces that I literally do not know how to use. And I know how to use some technology. I do this for a living. And I find myself wishing I just had a volume knob, or and to be able to adjust the radio manually. Like, there really is a space for that. And I think we overlook those sort of, that these cars still need to be built for human beings. And knobs work pretty well. And I don't know that that's the message I would send to the auto industry, is that maybe all touch panels aren't the best way to go.
Yeah, and I think if you saw the J.D. Power initial quality survey, I think it was week before last it came out, I think a lot of consumers feel the same way. And, we last year we did a panel on that, on interfaces, and it's a tough thing, and you're right. I mean, it's still in its infancy as far as being able to access the information that you want, and I think consumers expect in the vehicle. I think we still have a ways to go. I think the other thing, and with Apple CarPlay, for example, is this fragmentation that you're seeing. If you have a certain device, then you're good. I know with like BMW Connected Drive, for example, for years, it worked only with iPhone. And I see that a lot in the different cars I'm in too, where it's not always compatible, or someone has a different phone or even a different firmware. It causes problems. So, I wonder, how do you deal with that in the aftermarket? You're not as constrained in some ways as the automakers. So, how do you deal with that type of issue?
Well, and I would answer that to say that aftermarket is in a very unique position, very different than the OEs. And it was actually a slide put together in one of the studies done by the Consumer Electronics Association, CEA, several years ago. And it was a very powerful slide, and I continue to use it actually in a lot of presentations today. And that was showing the difference between the way technology got into a vehicle from an OE perspective, which is largely pushed on the consumer, because the consumer is going out and buying a new vehicle because they like the color, or they like the gas mileage it gets, or it has the right number of seats for them. And the technology that comes inside of it largely comes with the vehicle. While certainly infotainment has become a much more important part of the consumer purchase decision, it's rarely the only factor in that purchase decision. When we contrast that with the aftermarket is where consumers come and say, I want to be able to integrate my iPhone, or I want to be able to integrate my Android smartphone. I am going out and actively seeking to purchase a product that will allow me to do that. So in that way, the aftermarket has a huge opportunity. As Dan mentioned, the average age of the vehicle on the road in the United States today is 11 years old. There's roughly 220 million of those or more, and all of those consumers, or the majority of them, certainly have a smartphone. An iPhone, an Android phone, or something else. And I think we can safely assume that the majority of those consumers want to be able to do, whether it's making and receiving phone calls via Bluetooth, or listening to music that's streamed over the cloud and the internet. The majority of those consumers want to be able to do some of those functions. And so aftermarket certainly has a huge opportunity, and a very unique opportunity, because we are still the place that the consumer comes to get a feature that they want to have in their vehicle.
I know that you guys have a pretty stacked type of product rollout coming out. Seeing what you guys have at CES, I know you're introducing some stuff here. I would like you to talk about that a bit, and sort of what we're going to see from.
Yeah, really to summarize, I think what Pioneer's really goal over the last 3 years, and as I mentioned, it was 3 years ago here at CE Week in New York, where we formally announced the app radio. And the app radio was the first product of its kind because it introduced a touchscreen that you could install in your dash, and it allowed the applications to run on a connected smartphone. So it really let the smartphone do all the heavy lifting. And we've continued to evolve, and we've continued to learn a lot over the last 3 years. We've added Android support to iPhone. We've added MirrorLink. We've added Apple CarPlay, which, although we've announced it and we will ship it, or ship the firmware for that upgrade later this year, what is really important is also making sure that the consumers that made the investment and committed to Pioneer and our product, whether that was a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago with the original app radio, still continue to have connected car capabilities added to their vehicle. So what we're announcing here at the show this week, in addition to obviously our Apple CarPlay news and our app radio news, is a new application called App Radio Live. And it's actually available in the iTunes Store now. We've got iOS available today, and we're working on Android. But it's a completely new application which takes a lot of the feedback we've heard from consumers over the last 3 years and aggregates content into a single, easy-to-use interface. So you can get information on a displayed map about location-based services. You can get information coming from your calendar feed of your phone, coming from the calendar feed of your Facebook account. You can get information and media, music streamed in or internet radio streamed in, and even get information about news from Feedly sources and other sources. So it's a great application, and I've actually got, obviously, a video to show of the application in motion. But our goal with this App Radio Live app was to, again, continue to service the connected car consumers who had bought into what we were, really developing 3 years ago. So now a consumer can have an app radio product or an app radio mode product and not be left behind by the latest and greatest developments by the smartphone manufacturers. They still have an answer, and it brings them content in the car that they're looking for, but in a much easier way through this App Radio Live app. So.
Do you guys have the video here?
I think we've got the video, so if we can play that, that would be great.
So we don't have to walk out to the foyer?
We don't have to walk out the floor. Of course, we're demonstrating it today and this week. But. So that was App Radio Live, and as I mentioned, it really aggregates a lot of information and feeds. It all does it through the Pioneer Cloud, and then sends a single feed down to the App Radio Live app. The goals, of the App Radio Live app was of course to aggregate a lot of information into a single interface so that it was much easier for the consumer to consume. And that was based largely on feedback from App Radio users. And then the second was because it is completely backwards compatible to any consumers worldwide who have an app radio or an app radio mode product, and there's almost 2 million of those out there that we've sold product to over the last 3 years, was to ensure that those consumers also weren't left behind by the latest technology and have a solution that continues to give them the connected car experience.
Well, great, Ted. Thanks for helping us kick off the program. Dan, thanks for joining us in the conversation. We're going to start the official program in just a few minutes, so stick around. We got a very exciting program for you, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks.